Hey everybody, welcome to Between Drafts. Nathan Ball.
Not Eliason.
Appreciate you all being here with us. It's been a couple weeks since we've chatted.
It has. Although for the listener, we should still be on the weekly
Yeah,
cadence.
yeah,
We've used up our backlog though.
yeah. Yeah, we need to do two episodes.
Although honestly, it's kind of nice being on time again, I think, because when we were getting our episodes published and getting them out, we had one that came out a few weeks ago from Thanksgiving.
Right.
And it was coming out in January. And seeing that, I was kind of thinking, maybe we don't want that much.
We don't
backlog.
want a month and a half of buffer.
Exactly. Yeah. I felt like a bit much, but
maybe 2 weeks.
We're through the holidays. Yeah, a week or two is probably pretty good. But yeah, it's what day is today? February.
It's Friday.
It's Friday.
I don't know what day it
Early
is.
February.
It's Friday.
Yeah. And today we're going to talk about using feedback, right? So once you've gotten feedback on a draft, knowing what to keep, what to listen to, what to take seriously, how to implement it, how much to trust your intuition versus the readers, and kind of
based on who the feedback comes from as well.
Totally. And there's a point. I can't remember the word for this. We're both a little out of it. We're both coming off of being sick, so apologize that I sound like I have a smoker's cough and if we're a little lower energy today. But one thing I want to bookmark too on that is knowing what kind of book you're writing, and what kind of book the reader wants too. There's just like a lot of interesting topics here. Since I've got 2 weeks to finish Husk.
You thought it was 3.
I thought it was 3, and then I realized it yesterday that I actually only had 2, so that's exciting. So I'm on a bit of a sprint, and I'm definitely at the point now where it's like, okay, here's this big list of things I could do, but I'm not going to be able to do all of them. And so which ones do I do? And there's a kind of interesting question wrapped up in there too of like, is it worth pushing your turn in to get more of those things in? And like that whole question. So we should talk about that too. But should we do updates first?
Yeah.
So how's everything going on your end?
Good. I feel the best about the actual story that I've ever felt. I feel like it's more streamlined. I feel like there's 2 main plot lines, and they used to feel kind of running parallel, and now I've got them intertwining much more, and I think that's helped a ton. Just to make it feel like one cohesive story and not kind of jilted between 2. And so that's been huge. I took out one scene that was like 5,000 words.
Oh, wow.
The heist scene at the beginning.
Oh, you decided to take it out?
I ended up taking it out. Okay. But I've taken many of those ideas that I think it was doing really good work on and put it later in the story, kind of Act 3, mainly in Act 3. So the length of the book is actually the same, even without that. And it's let me go deeper in other places.
Cool.
So I've been really big on this idea of like fewer things, but better.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to just apply that to the book as much as possible. And I think it's made a really solid difference.
I really like that idea because, it is tempting to have a bunch of, and I'm guilty of this, a bunch of very fast-paced 2,000-word scenes.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of like what we talked about a few episodes ago about coming from the internet writing world and almost underwriting some things because you want to be maximally concise, but that's not always what leads to the most like immersion in the story.
100%. And so one thing I did that was helpful is I took, really just made a little diagram of every plot line that I had in the book, and it was like 8 things. I was like, okay, that's probably too many.
Okay.
How do I cut this down to 4 and focus everything on those?
So do you mean you had like 8 plot lines?
Or like
8 subplots?
Yeah. Like 2 that you know are probably the driving forces, and those 2 are still the same, but there was too much other stuff happening as well. That heist scene. Good scene, but looking back at it, it felt kind of random. Okay. Like when I'm talking to these agents or writing a synopsis or whatever, I find myself like when I had to chop the whole book into 500 words or whatever.
Yeah.
it was interesting to see what I would leave out.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that kind of showed me, okay, well, if I feel like I can leave that out here, then I can probably leave it out of the whole book, even though I'd spent way too much time working on that specific thing. And now it's not actually doing the work that it was meant to do.
Right.
And it's more of a veer off that main plot. And how do I just stick on that main plot?
Yeah, I remember when I read your pitch,
Mm-hmm.
I remember we talked about that,
Mm-hmm.
about how there was no mention of this kind of like subplot that
Yep.
provides some of the inciting incident.
Yep.
But then I read the draft where you removed it,
Yep.
and I didn't like it as much.
Yes. So
I'm curious.
So
to hear
that
how
was
you did
great
it.
feedback.
Yeah.
Because I was like, okay, it was doing something clearly, because
Yeah.
you and Elizabeth had that same feedback. And
Yeah.
you guys did feedback. So the way I thought about it was, okay, what did they say it was missing, and how can I get that, or can I get that stuff that's missing into the first, 5-8 chapters, whatever, before the inciting incident without that scene?
Yeah.
And I think the answer was yes. And I'm hoping next time that, when you guys read draft, I think it's draft 4 or 5, 4 or 4.5 now, that you'll see that come through.
Yeah.
Because the first act is only, I think it's only 1,500 words shorter. And that scene was 5,000. So I really just deepened everything else that was there.
Cool.
Using that space, if you will.
Yeah, it reminds me of a Reddit comment I read. The thread was something like, career authors, what do you wish you had done better in your first novel? Or like, what do you not like about your first novel?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody had a good response to it where he said, when I look back at my first novel, I look at it fondly, and the things that come to mind are, one, that I was trying to do too much, and two, that there were often scenes and conversations where I could have gone deeper that I wish I hadn't rushed through. And I thought that was really, really helpful to read, because when I was going through playing for the final draft, I had that question in mind, right? Like, are there conversations where I should be going deeper and not assuming that I need to like get through this conversation to get back to the action?
Yeah.
Because people do enjoy good dialogue.
Very common writing advice that I went into writing books with is, you're going to want to cut 20 to 30% of this book.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's true for me. I think it, I there have been things I wanted to cut, but I often want to add on to the things I keep as well.
Yeah.
And they kind of balance each other out in terms of just total word count.
I've found that too, because we'll get into like various types of feedback, but one that I got from a few people, and I might have talked about this before, was that there were too many out and backs. So instead of the story feeling like it was purely moving forward, there were a lot of situations where it like went somewhere and then came back to the same setting.
You had like a hub and spoke model.
Yeah, kind of like a hub and spoke model, which is good for episodic television, right? Like Dan Harmon's Story Circle is kind of all about this model, right? Which is kind of like the hero's journey, but concatenated to work for like episodes. Yeah. But in doing it too much in a story, it starts to feel almost like lethargic. And so one of the things I've been doing is there was one big out and back in the first act, and I completely cut it, but I ended up pulling some of those details and conversations into other places. And so even though I deleted 3,000 or 4,000 words, the word count is still the same, because I ended up being able to expand other parts. And I think it's actually much better for it. The other thing that comes to mind with that, I know something we've both struggled with, is having artifacts from earlier drafts or even earlier books that we really want to hold on to, right? Like, I mean, you were originally writing a heist novel.
Yep.
And it's not a heist novel anymore.
Nope. Not at all. It's a revolution.
Yeah. And so it made a lot of sense for there to be a big heist scene in it, right? I mean, for me, one of the big ones was I originally thought that there was going to be this romance arc that emerged by the end of the book, and then ultimately deciding that worked better emerging over 3 books. changed a lot of the conversations and things in this book, but I'm still finding places where I haven't fully cleaned that up yet.
Yeah.
And it's hard to let some of those scenes or those conversations go because I like them. Yeah. But yeah, it's better without them. I mean, the other one I told you about is I just deleted a major character and rolled him into another character. But I was really attached to him because he was in the original book that I threw away. And so being willing to like kill that person off essentially.
Totally. And maybe maybe they're a character in book 3.
Maybe. Yeah. Doesn't really work anymore.
No, it probably doesn't.
but in general, yeah, you can totally find ways to bring them back.
I do think one thing that's helped me when editing is never fully deleting something. Just having a Word doc that is essentially deleted scenes and just putting things in there. Because it doesn't fit in the story, I found that it doesn't fit where I originally had it in the story. Maybe there's 4, 5, 6 paragraphs within that scene that actually do fit, but 10 chapters later.
Totally.
Or even earlier, whatever.
Yeah. Or there might be something you revealed in there that you just need to make sure you reveal elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right. So, on the topic of getting feedback and then knowing how to incorporate it, right? Like, because this I think is one of the really hard things with getting feedback and with editing is you really can't, I think, do it alone.
Yeah.
It'd be pretty hard to do all of your editing because there are just going to be things that aren't obvious to you that are obvious to other people. But then as soon as you give it to people and the more people you give it to, the more feedback you get. Then you have to figure out like, what the hell do I do with all of this feedback I've received?
Yeah. And some of it might be contradictory.
Exactly. Well, yeah, oftentimes a lot of it is. And so, when you're sending something out for feedback, how do you think about taking seriously the feedback that you're getting, whether it's from, me or Elizabeth or from a professional editor, a random beta reader, anybody? Like, how do you think about that?
I think it's very true that the feedback giver is very good at spotting problems and less good at giving solutions.
Yeah.
And I think that changes if it's somebody else who writes a ton like you. I think you're better at giving solutions than somebody who reads a ton.
Right.
Like the reader is very good at picking out, that didn't make sense. Something fell off. This character is boring. The world, breaks this rule at this point, and that took me out. Those are excellent problems to find, and then it's people like to give ideas.
Yeah.
And sometimes they give great ideas, but I've also found that the solution that works in the story might be very different than people expect.
Yeah.
So to really I'm looking for what problems are they identifying, and specifically if it's a problem that somebody else has also identified, then I really start to notice, because people have preferences and tastes and all that stuff. But if it starts to be multiple people, and I'm pretty intentional about who beta readers are, so everybody reads it. I'm like, I really respect your opinion. So if multiple people like that see it, I'm like, all right, that's a true problem, and I need to fix it somehow.
Totally.
How do you think about it?
Do you have a good example of like somebody giving a solution that was the wrong solution, but a good problem?
Let me think. Yeah, so we talked about this heist scene, so I'll stick with that. You and Elizabeth both wanted me to add it back.
Yeah.
And I think that was the wrong solution, but because the main work it was doing was establishing this relationship between the main character and his friend, and the friend is extremely critical for the entire series. Like, they are kind of the 1A, 1B main characters, even though it's from one of them's point of view. So it's doing a ton of work in establishing that relationship as well as the world that they are in. I think the world got established elsewhere, and I could add those things in later, but I still needed some scene and like early on to establish that relationship. So instead of adding that scene back because it is like a roundabout of the plot. Like it felt like a bit of a detour, if you will. What I did instead was there was another scene where they're in the same place, but I didn't have them interacting. It was like one is down on the stage and one is up in the stands.
Mm-hmm.
And I just made it before that happens. They have a lot of the same dialogue interactions that they had in the heist scene. I just moved that dialogue to the different scene, essentially.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So it still establishes this dynamic between them.
Cool. Yeah. I had one that comes to mind where I had one reader who's a big sci-fi reader and really, really likes hard sci-fi.
Yeah.
And so a lot of his feedback was about how the technology in the book wasn't explained enough and could be explained a lot deeper. And
meanwhile, I'd be like, huh?
Well, so I actually started to go down the path of like, and he was saying, oh, if you really want this to be a hard sci-fi novel like Three Body Problem or The Martian, you got to expand all these things. And I went down that path a little bit, but then I kind of realized that's actually not the book I'm writing. It's not meant to be a super hard sci-fi novel where at least, this part of the universe isn't meant to be like that. It's meant to be a little bit lighter, kind of like closer to a Leviathan Wakes or something.
A Blake Crouch.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Where it's a little more action heavy and a little less getting lost in the science. And
it's almost more philosophical than scientific.
Yeah, I'd say so. There's a lot more exploration on those topics than the mechanics of how the transfer process works or things like that. But so I kind of had to be like, oh wait, I actually don't want to make all these changes because it changes what I'm doing. But he was right that descriptions in general were fairly shallow. And so that was very helpful for looking at how some of the things were described and saying, oh, I don't need to go all the way to a 3-body problem, 2 or 3 page deep dive into like how the droplets work. Right. Yeah. But people might have no idea what this thing looks like, right? Like I need to fix that. And that was super helpful, right? Of saying, okay, I don't want to change what the book is, but he is right that like this description is kind of lacking. And so that was very helpful, right? So there is this kind of question too of like a reader might want a certain type of book, and they're going to project that onto your book,
which makes sense. That's what they like to enjoy. That's what they like to read.
Totally, right? But you might not be writing that book, right? And so that gets into a tricky situation or a tricky consideration too, because you kind of want feedback from people who don't read your genre because they're going to point out different things. People who do read your genre, but you also don't want to over cater to them because they're probably not your target reader in the first place.
Yeah, your core reader is going to be the genre reader of whatever it is.
Exactly, yeah. And that's one thing I've been kind of struggling with these last few weeks because my genre readers have generally really enjoyed it, had very positive feedback, even on the earlier drafts that I now think are like shit, right? But
I get that.
yeah, right. But the non-genre readers are all saying basically the same thing about some of the relationships, especially the relationships with the female characters. And it's like,
female characters are hard to write.
Dude, it is hard. Yeah,
it's hard.
Really hard. And so it's like, okay, that definitely needs to be improved and is kind of my main focus with this final draft. And I don't want to go like too far in the relationship side of the book if the genre readers are enjoying the fast-paced action side of the book.
You could, what is, romantasy? What is that for sci-fi?
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe you're the guy.
Romance side. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily. Yeah. Well, that's apparently already happening with thrillers, right? Did we talk about this?
It's like everywhere.
It's like, exactly. Just like bolt on romance. Well, it kind of makes sense because 80% of the book buying market is women.
I also think that romance is an excellent subplot and not, at least for me, not a main plot that I care about.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are that way where it's a really good 10-20% of the plot, but
Yeah.
if it's 80-90, I'm so far out.
Totally. And I'm, one of the main audience, or one of the main audiences I'm thinking about is one, genre sci-fi readers, and also nonfiction readers who want to read more fiction and will usually, like, if they're going to read it, they'll pick up a sci-fi book.
Yeah.
And those are like mostly techie dudes.
Yep.
And so they're not going to be
And it's like a faster paced sci-fi book.
totally faster paced. They're not going to be super invested in like these big relationship arcs, but you want them to be there. I think Pierce Brown does a good job of this with
Great example.
Red Rising.
Yeah.
Because like the Darrow and Virginia plot line is there, but it's not particularly overbearing. It's probably less than 10% of Red Rising, and similar amount subsequent. And it's important for advancing it, but it's definitely not like a focus of the book. How much do you think about like intuition and believing, like intuition and going off of like what you think is right versus going off of what the reader thinks is right? Like, that's kind of like a weird question, but
I'm just trying to write a book that I would want to read.
that's a good answer.
And I think there are a lot of readers who enjoy similar stuff that I do.
Yeah.
Maybe that's hopeful thinking.
No, I
enjoy.
You can't write for everyone, right?
I enjoy fantasy and sci-fi that also makes me think about the world a little bit differently. So I'm leaning into that. Like, okay, if my big conflict is like world conflict, I think about conflict on a couple levels. So world conflict being, why is there tension in the broader world and society?
Yeah.
And it's, for me, I think everything works as a pendulum. I think you see that throughout history with politics. I'm mainly thinking about politics, but even with other things, just like where culture is centered at the time.
Yeah.
I think that things are always changing, and I think it works as a pendulum. So my worldwide conflict is, okay, if we hit match technology, what does the other side of that pendulum look like? And you can argue like, oh, it's the Stone Age.
Yeah.
For me, I was like, what if that is magic? And what if we're swinging back and technology is decreasing, magic's increasing, and they don't coexist? So I'm like, okay, that's one level of conflict that I'm leaning in towards. How do I kind of drive everything towards that while also leaning into like the character level conflict?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, if what the reader wants is, or like a beta reader or whatever wants, drives back to those things, then I'm probably going to incorporate it. And if it's like, oh, about something else, then I'm less likely to incorporate it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's just coming back to what is like you were saying, I think it's a great question. What book are you writing?
Yeah. And does the feedback make that book better or not? I have kind of a like more woo answer to the question, where something I've been trying to be better about is when I hear feedback, just that instant gut reaction to it. Is it like oh yeah, that's what needs to be fixed? Or is it I don't know, right? And
like trusting
that immediate response to seeing the feedback, right? Like, is it a very strong, like, oh yes, okay, that's what I was looking for, right? Because I feel like, especially once you're in the editing phase, there are things that aren't working, and you're trying to figure out what they are and how to fix them. And then you'll get feedback, and some of it you'll read and you'll go, oh wow, yeah, that is a problem I need to fix.
Yeah.
And others, I'll see it and I'll go, I don't know if that's like really a problem, but I'll then sometimes try to convince myself that they're right. Like this is, I think, the habit I'm trying to get out of, right? Of, oh, maybe I do need to fix that thing, or maybe that is a problem. And I think that's maybe the wrong way to do it. It might be better to just trust that gut instinct and only write down and try to implement the stuff that immediately feels resonant when someone says it.
Yeah.
because I know you run into this too. Like pretty quickly, you've got a list of dozens of things that you feel like you need to fix, and it turns into this like insurmountable project. When the reality is like you probably don't need to do most of them.
Yeah.
Or if you try to do all of them, you will never finish the book.
Totally.
Because you'll just keep
Yep.
editing and keep getting feedback, and at some point it has to get out the door.
Yeah. What I've been, and this is, I think, an idea that I actually learned from you is the like top down editing and just trying to, every piece of feedback I get, trying to get, okay, this is their feedback for this specific scene, but before I edit that specific scene, what does it mean for the story at large? And just go, story, act, sequence, chapter, paragraphs, or whatever.
Yeah.
Because I have a tendency to spend so much time on those lower level pieces because I think it's much easier to see those results quickly.
Yeah.
Because I can edit, 4,000 or 5,000 words in a day and feel great about it. But then if I have to change that scene later because of a story level change, then whatever. So I've been trying to be better about that and look at the feedback. Maybe I have these 10 things, but really that's one, that rolls up into one higher level change, if you will.
Yeah. Because it's, especially being in the time crunch that I'm in now, right? It's like looking at some of this stuff and saying, okay, like that's just not going to get.
It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. Yeah. And
how do you think about prioritizing?
Similar to what you just said, where one, I have all the little changes written down, and my temptation is definitely to start with the small ones first.
Because you knock them out.
Exactly. It feels good to check things off. But as I do it, I know that I am procrastinating making these big changes that are going to be the most important ones to make. Like removing that out and back in the first act, it was like 8,000 to 10,000 words of stuff that needed to be edited and rearranged, and it's like a lot of work.
It is,
right? It's especially because it's harder than just writing those 8,000, 10,000 words initially, because you've got to keep in mind all the stuff that happens later.
Yeah.
And so as I'm changing it, I'm also having to think, okay, there's like this conversation that needs to change later, and this one, and this one, and this one. Like now this character is getting introduced here. Like the effect of the change really like spreads across the whole book. You have to go back and adjust so many other things, but it's going to be the most impactful one to do. Yeah. And so that's one thing I've been trying to do as I get into this last sprint is like, okay, some of these little ones just aren't going to happen. Like I've just got to let them go. But these big ones definitely do. And it's going to be a better book if I make a few of these big changes and let some of the little ones go than if I try to do every single one of them.
For me, this is one of the hardest things about books versus other products. You can release a different type of product and then just keep iterating on it.
You can ship new updates each week.
Totally.
Yeah.
A book, you can't really go in and, hey, I might have made a mistake in Act 2. I've changed these 3 chapters. Here are the new ones.
Yeah.
You don't do that.
Although, I mean, you could.
You could.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why people don't do it in trad, because you have so many books already printed.
Totally.
And there's so much production stuff that goes into it. I could see it becoming more normal in self-pub as the tools for final production get better. It's like, I hate to say this, but I think that the days of like a long copy editing period are not long for this world. Like the AI tools are just getting so good at doing that level of feedback that we probably will get to a point where you could more easily reproduce the final version of a book pretty quickly by having a like mostly AI powered copy editor and production tool. So that, because like the problem with making edits to a book after it's been produced, right, is like, well, okay, now we got to recopy edit it, and we got to reformat it, and we got to like redo all those things, and that takes a long time. But if the tools get good enough that you can quickly re-edit and reformat it and get it back out, then you could do that more. But I would also hate having that at the back of my head.
That power.
Yeah, that I could keep changing this and keep improving it after it's out, because then, yeah, I guess I go back and forth. It'd be better to have a 90% good version out today to start getting readers, and then have the 95% version come out in 6 months. Like, that might be better.
This
Maybe
is
it's
also
not.
the direction video games are going, and it's awful.
That's a good point. Yeah,
And I hate it.
like DLC.
And I will not buy, like, I won't buy the new video game because I'm like, you're shipping a half-baked product.
Yeah, that's a good point. Are you gonna get Civ 7?
I'm thinking about not.
Yeah,
It's one of my favorite games ever.
yeah.
Because it seems like it's a half-baked product, and they're releasing the DLC in a month.
I know you have to buy Great Britain as a separate add-on. It's like kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, this is clearly just a money grab.
Yeah, I will say on the flip side of that, sometimes early access games do work well, right? Like Satisfactory did this, where it was in early access for 3 years.
That's a different frame.
Yeah, that's a good point. They're not saying it's done.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying you get to play this unfinished version of it.
And we're going to take your feedback and make the full thing better.
Yeah.
That could be cool for a book.
It could.
Especially if, maybe not for, also, I think I'm putting too much weight on myself for this being the first novel I release. Like, I want it to be so excellent because it's the first one.
Yeah.
And I think that makes me go slower and spend almost too much time on feedback, honestly.
Yeah, well, that's a tough balance too. I mean, the mindset that I've started to get more in is that, like, this is just the first book and there's going to be a lot of books.
Yeah.
And I don't need this one to be the opus,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because that definitely does happen for some authors, but it doesn't happen a lot more often than it happens.
Totally.
And so I've been getting more in the mindset of, like, it'd be better to just keep trying to get better and keep getting at least one book out per year. And, like, it will eventually lead to being that good versus trying to get it that perfect on the first try.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also hard when you're doing a series, because
You've committed to this.
you've kind of committed to this world. Yeah. And these, 3 or 6 or however many books.
And if book one hits, that cascade effect is super real. And if it doesn't hit, then that cascade effect is still
Pretty
very
real. Yeah. I mean, are there any series you can think of where somebody pitches you on reading it and they say the first book isn't that good, but in 2 and 3 and 4 it starts to get really excellent?
Yeah. Girls say this about Akatar.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
Interesting.
When Elizabeth was trying to get me to read it, she was like, the first book isn't as good, and then it gets way better.
Huh. Okay.
Which, and whether that's true or not, like, I still think book one has to be
it has to be pretty
decent
good.
enough
Yeah,
for enough
yeah.
people to read the thing and
Totally.
finish it and want to buy book two. So I don't know how much truth there is to that.
Yeah. You definitely hear the opposite a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
That book one is awesome, and then it really falls off in 2 or 3. I mean, I remember somebody saying this about the Children of Time series. Have you read that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where it was like book one is awesome,
Mm-hmm.
and then a lot of people seem to not like book 2 very much, but apparently book 3 is really good.
I only read book one.
Yeah, I've only read book 1 as well, and so I had a friend who was saying just read 1 and then read 3.
Just skip
two
two
entirely.
It's tough.
They were like, you're not really going to need it to understand what's going on in 3. You can just go straight there. And I was like, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Wouldn't work for a lot of series, but
yeah.
It is tough, because it is one of those things too, where it's like the book has to get done at some point.
Totally.
Right. And I don't know about you, but I know that for me, there's always going to be this list of changes.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Like, you're never not going to have a list of things you could go back and change or improve. And honestly, the hard thing too at this point is, like, there's also the temptation to just scrap it and start from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, I know that I'm a better writer now
Than you were
than I was when I started
9
it.
months ago, whatever.
Yeah, it's 7-8 months ago.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah, it would be better if I just started over
Yeah.
and, use the same structure and all the same characters and everything, but, like, wrote it from scratch. But it would probably just happen again.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely feel that way about Crypto Confidential. Like,
That's true. Yeah. You have a book out. Do you? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
What do you feel about that?
I go back. I've looked at pieces of it since it came out, and like, I just don't think that some of the dialogue is very good. I don't think the settings are very well set. Like, there's a lot of things about it that I look at and I'm just like, man, like that aspect was not that well done compared to what I feel like I can do now. But people really enjoy it.
Yeah.
You know, people like it.
So what does that make you think?
It brings me back more to this mindset of it's better to just keep getting something out and keep getting better, because there's how good you think it is, which is probably like down here.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's how good it actually is, which is going to be higher than that.
Hopefully.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. For a lot of people, it's the opposite, I suppose. Like,
I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, yeah, and that's the hard thing too is
how do you know?
Yeah. I mean, because we everybody knows someone who does something. It sounds bad, but I mean, everyone's
you don't want the American Idol effect, like
exactly.
The audition.
That's a perfect example, right? You don't want the American Idol audition where you're like, people have been telling me I'm a great singer my whole life.
Yeah.
You get up there and it's just terrible.
It's like nightmare scenario.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the imposter syndrome, like spotlight effect thing. It's right.
Uh-huh.
You're imagining everybody else looking at this and going like, that was terrible. Like, why did you make that thing? Yeah. But I also think that you probably can't make anything good unless you always think that your stuff is bad.
Yeah.
Right. Which is kind of a depressing
double-edged sword a little
bit. Kind of a depressing thought to have, but yeah, I don't know. How are you thinking about that with like getting this feedback from this editor?
Yeah. Well, it hasn't started yet from the editor, so we'll
see.
Right.
I'm just saying, like, you know, let's say that you get the feedback from the editor. It's very helpful.
Yep.
They give you a lot of good stuff.
Yep.
And then, you know, you spend another 3 or 4 months implementing it.
Yep.
And then even after all of that, you have trouble getting a deal, getting an agent, whatever, you know, like God forbid that happens. Like, what are you going to do?
I'd probably self-publish at that point.
Yeah.
If I feel good about it.
Yeah.
And that's I think a whole nother conversation we can have is how I'm trying to think through that whole self-publish trad pub.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard. One, it's really hard to get like the trad pub, like an attractive trad pub deal in fiction is very hard to come by.
Yeah.
And two, the timeline is wild.
Yeah.
So, but there are big positives as well.
Totally.
So that's a whole nother episode. We can talk about the current state of how I'm thinking about that. I actually would want to hear your opinion on it, but
that would be my opinion too, right? Is it's like, because at the end of the day, not getting accepted doesn't mean it's not good.
Right. And the other thing I'm thinking a lot about is who do I want the gatekeeper to be?
Mm-hmm.
If, you know, for whatever reason, I don't come across an agent that's like, yeah, let's do it. And then acquire an editor that's like, here's $100,000, hopefully more.
Yeah.
Do I want that to be the gatekeeper, or do I want, okay, I'm a very good marketer. Let's see if we can get this in the hands of a few thousand people, see what they think, and then the market is the gatekeeper.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's where I ended up landing. Yeah.
I think there are also more and more people who do self-publish at first, and then there other people, the agents and all of them are like, oh wow, this sold.
Yeah. I mean, if I were an agent,
that's a great signal.
That's what I would be doing.
Yeah.
You know, if I were going to get into being a book agent, I wouldn't take pitches. I would just go read self-published fiction.
Oh, interesting.
You know?
Yeah.
Like,
see what sold, see what the reviews are.
Yeah. Find stuff that has under 200 reviews, but like super positive ones and very excited people on Goodreads or whatever, and read those books and then try to poach those authors because it's way more validated.
Totally.
You know? And they're not at the point where they're making, you know, tens of thousands of dollars a month or whatever on KDP, where they might not want to take a trad deal, but they, you know, have potential and, you know, they're early probably. And it seems like that would be a lot easier to sell to a publisher.
Yeah.
maybe it's not. Maybe publishers don't want to take self-pub people as much, but it seems like they are pretty open to it in fiction.
Yeah, or at least much more so than
In
10
yeah.
years ago. I talked to a guy yesterday who he was great, and he sold tons of books, and mainly thriller category, named Greg Hurwitz.
Okay.
Hurwitz. He's a new book coming out soon called Nemesis.
Self-pub or trad-pub?
Trad.
Cool.
He's got like 20, 25 books out.
Wow.
Super successful author. And he was saying that he would wait for the trad pub.
Really?
Part of me was like, is this because you had success that way
Yeah,
or whatever?
yeah.
But at the same time, this dude's been super successful in it, and he said it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Maybe he's right.
Totally.
So I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tough needle to thread, because it's like, yeah, do you scrap a book to try to make another one?
Yeah, and I don't think I'd scrap it.
Yeah, that's where I would draw the
line.
line.
I definitely wouldn't scrap it.
Yeah, I would definitely edit and improve to try to get the trad deal. I don't think I would scrap.
Same.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because
if I'm going to write a new book anyway, I can always just query that again.
Totally.
It takes away the like unknown quantity, if you will.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, you can't just keep spinning your wheels.
No. And if you self-published it, and even if only 100 people bought and read it, if they enjoyed it, that's 100 readers for your next book that you didn't have before.
True.
Right? Like, that definitely helps set a foundation to like get the compounding going, right? Because it does feel like an author career is something that
compounds.
It's very compounding, and you do have to be kind of patient with it.
Especially if you do self-publishing.
Yeah. When you're going back to the like feedback question, because I think we have kind of different, we've taken different strategies on this. How do you think about like number of people to get feedback from?
Yeah, we've definitely,
I've changed my mind on this, so I'm curious to hear.
I wanted a smaller number of people who, and I wanted a split between people who like this genre and people who are just like voracious readers who have really good opinions. I wanted both of those groups, but I didn't want a ton of each. So I probably 3 or 4 folks in each camp. So not a huge amount of people by any means. And I know my tendency is to over edit and to take too much time. And I thought if I sent it to 20 people in each of those groups, I would spend way too much time. I was like, give me like the biggest levers to pull, and I'll pull those levers. Yeah.
That's more of where I've landed now. I was definitely on the side of getting more feedback from more people, and like, more the better. But I mean, one, like you said, not everyone is great at giving feedback. And either more so because a lot of people just might not give you that much to work with. And so I think there is this process you have to go through that takes years of finding good people to give you feedback on your writing, which is, I mean, they're really hard to find.
It's a commitment.
Yeah, it is a commitment
on their part. Like, it's a very kind thing to people to do.
It really is, because they're going to have to read a whole 100,000 word book.
And you're telling them, hey, this might not be that good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
By the way, you might not enjoy it.
They could go read Iron Wing or whatever is the like guaranteed you're going to have a good time book of the season. Or they could read your like somewhat finished draft, right? And granted, some people like being at that end of it, but yeah, it is a big ask. And it almost feels bad when somebody reads your draft and then doesn't have a ton of useful stuff to say. Yeah. Because then it feels a little bit like, I feel a little bit like I've wasted their time, you know?
So why did you change your mind on this?
I just had enough people who, you know, I was in the mindset of sending it to more people, and too many of them didn't have that much feedback that I hadn't already heard. And I think it goes back to, like, when I was doing Crypto Confidential in the beginning, I didn't have as good of an intuition for like what feedback was true or not. Fair. And so getting more people reading it helped to, like you said, if everybody's saying this is a problem, then it's probably a problem. Yeah. But if your intuition gets better, you only need 1 or 2 people, or even just one, to mention something, and then you'll have a good sense of, okay, yeah, that is something I should implement. I mean, I also think that ChatGPT is a factor here too, because it's like the feedback that you can get with Pro now is so insanely good that it's kind of hard for most beta readers to compete with that.
And you get it in 5 minutes.
Yeah, if that.
Yeah.
And so that's been an interesting thing too. Like I've actually been comparing the draft feedback that I get from people to the feedback that I've gotten from doing a bunch of GPT prompts. And that's kind of like the extra readers, you know? It's like I can have a few really good readers, right? Like you give really good feedback. Oseka gets really good feedback. Elizabeth gives really good feedback. Like a couple other friends who, you know, really enjoy this stuff and can give really detailed feedback. And if one of them mentions something and it comes up in a few of the pro prompts, that's usually a good sign that there's something there. And that I have found, I mean, that's really helpful for cutting down on editing time too, or like logistics. I mean, I had basically a spreadsheet of all the different drafts and who I had sent them to and then what they had said.
Absolutely.
And it just turned into this whole like logistical problem.
The other problem that I had was I'll send somebody, like for example, I sent my buddy Robbie a draft midway through January.
Yeah.
It's currently a different book than I sent him.
That too.
And he's somebody who I think when he gives the feedback, it'll probably be great feedback. But only a portion of it will still apply to the, and you know, hopefully it's like 80% of it will still apply to the current book. But it's not the same book.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
some of it's going to be a little too late.
And you're like this too. Like you send the draft off to Scribe and you're still making changes for those 3 weeks.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I mean, that is one of, I think, the really great gifts of having the AI tools for getting feedback is being able to get it basically instantly and checking that against your assumptions. And I really feel like for Husk 2 or for the book that I'm probably going to write before Husk 2, just to like take a break and let the outline marinate, like a lot of the feedback is going to be AI first and then, you know, readers kind of supplementing that because it has just gotten really good and it lets you move a little quicker
for sure
as well. Yeah. Have you found, what about when you're doing your own reads, like for your work and trying to compile feedback for yourself? Like, is there something, because it's harder to get bored or get confused, right? Because you already know your world. So are there things that you do to like prompt yourself while you're reading or to get yourself into that headspace so that you can be a better editor of your own work?
I think just reading a lot helps me a ton.
Yeah.
I read a lot of the similar type of books.
Yeah.
And be intentional about, okay, I really liked this or I didn't like this. I zoned out during these 4 pages. Why did I just zone out?
Yeah,
like, what was it? Stuff like that. Also, I think reading it and having some kind of journal where I'm scribbling down ideas like helps a bunch. Having things to come back to. I talked about that little like table that I made with the plot lines and everything. Like having those things in mind while I'm reading it, be like, oh, this whole scene ties to this plot line that I want to diminish so I can go deeper on these other things. How do I turn this 100 words into 50?
Yeah. I like that.
Stuff like that.
You've mentioned this before, but like reading certain books while you're editing to try to like get a bit of that author's vibe.
Yeah, or just copy work or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm going through Counts of Monte Cristo right now because there's a revenge element to that book that I think is super satisfying and very well done, that I think I could incorporate some of that, not plot line, but just that vibe. Cool. And there's, in Lord of the Rings, there's just like undercurrent of hope throughout the whole thing. And I think that's super powerful. And my book is pretty dark.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do I have that undercurrent of hope as well?
I like that. Yeah. Just as like a simpler example, we were talking about, my tendency of trying to get through the conversations and the slow parts to like get back to the action.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was actually the second Leviathan Wakes book, Caliban's War. I've been reading that, and that was something that kind of surprised me in that book because it feels fast paced, but there are pretty long sections of just people talking about things.
Just chatting.
Yeah.
Just yapping.
Just yapping.
Yeah.
And it works. Like I don't feel bored. I don't put it down.
So are you like trying to figure out what it is about those dialogues that like they're longer, but you're still...
It's a bit of that. And it's also, I think, a bit of like permission giving in the sense of like, oh, it's okay if you have 2,000 words of people talking about things, as long as there's conflict in the dialogue.
Yeah.
And as long as it's, because like that's obviously true for say literary fiction or romance or like these genres where you're not expecting an action component. But my bias has definitely been that we just got to get back to like, fighting,
doing stuff,
and adventuring and like discovering things and all of that. And it's very helpful in that sense to see that and be like, oh, okay, I'm not falling off here. So other people probably won't if I like bring some of that in too, while staying in the same genre, of course.
Absolutely.
Like that to me has been pretty helpful.
I like that permission giving. That's really good.
It does feel like you do need to do a lot of permission giving. I think about that too with, it's like there's certain topics that you don't want to touch, right? Like, the first Red Rising has a lot of, we use Red Rising as an example a lot, but I guess most people who are listening have probably read it. There's like very dark elements.
Yeah, it's very dark.
Yeah, like super dark. And there's a lot of discomfort, I think, writing about those topics, because I think there's always a fear as an author of like whatever I put into the book is going to reflect on me in some way, especially if a family member reads it or a friend reads it, or like what are they going to think of you for putting that in. And yeah, if you're going to have dark elements, it's like reading have you ever read Choke by Chuck Palahniuk?
I know who the author is, but
he's the author of Fight Club, right? And so all of his books are really dark. I mean, the actual Fight Club book is definitely darker than the movie, and Choke is even darker than Fight Club, where it's been a minute since I read it, but basically the premise is that like the character gets off on autoerotic asphyxiation.
Wow.
And is like in support groups for it, and is like getting choked out and choking other people out in these like sex scenes and stuff. And it's hard not to read that and think like, what is wrong with Chuck?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it does make for a good book. Right. And I feel like Stephen King, probably has an element of this too. And he's talked about it as well, right? Where he's like, yeah, The Shining is about an alcoholic writer who murders his family, or tries to murder his family, right? Like, he was an alcoholic writer, So I feel like the permission giving in the editing phases and like with the books you're reading can be helpful as well. I don't know.
Yeah. And for me, I think the permission giving in some ways the prose itself. Just from writing online, my prose became very choppy, if you will. And so to read something that's a bit more lyrical, like Grapes of Wrath or whatever, Count of Monte Cristo,
East of Eden.
Yeah, it's permission giving as well.
Totally.
Yeah.
Anything else we should say on the
I don't think so.
taking and digesting feedback?
No, I think that was good.
That was pretty good.
Yeah.
It's shorter. What are you doing with your book while you're waiting to give it to the editor? Because you're
editing more.
You're doing more. Okay, yeah. Did you end up picking someone? Did you end up locking someone down?
Susan Chang.
Okay.
Yes.
Is she the one who did Hyperion and stuff, or is she the other?
No, if it goes well, I'll probably ask her if she wants to come chat about her stuff on here. But she seems great. She gave excellent feedback on the first, call it 10 or so pages.
Okay.
That led to me making a few changes that I think were very positive. I was like, if I can do that for the whole book, that's great.
Yeah. It's awesome. And when is she going to be able to look at it? March?
End of March.
End of March.
So
Okay.
it's another month and a half, call it.
But you can do a lot of editing in 6
Yeah, I
weeks.
think
Yeah.
like my goal is I want it to be in such a good spot when it gets to her that her feedback is very high leverage.
Cool.
Like I don't want her like spending time on like dumb stuff.
Yeah.
That I can just, I know I need to change and just go change it. Boom, she gets it. And it's as high leverage as possible.
Sweet. Are you going to, when you send it to her, are you going to send that version to other beta readers too?
Good question. Yeah, I feel like that I haven't thought about it, but that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably some people who haven't read it before.
Oh, that's a good idea.
That's
Get
one
fresh
thing
eyes on it.
about reading things. I find it's hard to, like, I don't want to send you every single draft
Right.
because I actually found when I was reading Hust again, I was like, because I know where this goes, some of the twists don't hit as hard.
Right.
And it's not that doesn't say anything about the story. That's just literally, I already know what happens.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I just know that, oh, that character is a villain. And I know that the whole time.
Right.
Even before you reveal it.
Right.
So I felt like I wouldn't be able to give you as good a feedback because of my pre-existing knowledge.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, I can also be like, hey, like I know this happens later in the story. This is a great spot to foreshadow it.
Yeah. That's a good point.
So there's a little give and take, but
yeah, there's almost like a rationing you have to do with your beta readers. Right. Of, okay, I don't want to send you this version because I want you to like
100%.
have like the fresh experience at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And if they get too many versions,
It's also a ton of time.
Yeah, and it's a ton of time,
Yeah.
right? Or they might get confused between versions too, or the rationing is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Honestly though, I do feel like I'm moving more in the direction of like a little less feedback a little later, and trusting myself more earlier on. Yeah, because there's always that problem too, right? It's like at the end of the day, what is that Steinbeck line? Like, no great work of art was ever made by a committee.
Great line.
Yeah. I think it's in East of Eden. Yeah. Or it's like, and so if you index on getting everybody else's opinion too much, you end up with this just like mishmash that's no longer like your thing anymore.
Yep. I've been thinking about that with the AI stuff too.
Yeah.
I've been getting less and less feedback from AI. I'm like, I know what I need to change.
Yeah.
I don't need this extra validation that it needs to change. Just go do it.
It's fair. Yeah.
It's a hard balance.
It is a hard balance, especially, I mean, because like I'll get feedback too, and I'll almost be annoyed if it's not detailed enough or if there isn't enough of it. Because I think in my head, there's so many things to change and fix and improve. And so if somebody else doesn't see equally as many problems with it, I feel a little like robbed.
Yep. Yeah, I wanted more. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Tell me it sucks and why.
Yeah. Maybe that's not Maybe that's not healthy either. Maybe just be like happy that somebody only had this problem with it. I don't know.
Good point.
That's another good episode topic, like mental health as a writer. the appropriate amount of self-loathing for your work.
Yeah.
Well, should we wrap there? Anything else you wanted to touch on?
No, I think that's good. Let's do current thinking on self-publishing, triad publishing, and how to explore that next, maybe.
Cool. Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah.
But yeah, since you're still between those worlds, and I'm going this way, and I'm seeing the other one.
Yeah, exactly. And seeing just, I feel like a lot of people probably get to that point where it's like, okay, I've, at least in fiction, where I've written this whole freaking book.
Yeah.
What
do I do?
What now?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Cool. Let's do that next time.
Sweet.
We should mention that we have clips now on Instagram.
Thanks to that.
So follow Between Drafts Pod on Instagram, and we'll have bits from the show there. Obviously on YouTube as well, where we have full episodes that you can enjoy too.
Yeah. Hit us with any questions you might have, any
yeah.
specific episodes, things we haven't talked about, topics, whatever.
Totally. It's great ideas for future episodes. So yeah, you can email us betweendraftspod@gmail.com. You can hit us up on X. You're at
NathanPaul27.
And I'm at Nat Eliason. And I think that does it. We'll see you next time.